Okay, today we're going to be talking about creating depth in our painting or using aerial perspective to create more depth in our painting. And that's real important because our canvas is flat, it's two-dimensional, and we're trying to create the illusion of things in 3 dimensions, of things receding and going back. So the big problem, especially with using photographs, is that the camera doesn't always pick up aerial perspective, the idea of things receding, for several reasons. One of them is the values can be off. And even though this photograph here, this is in California, the darks do get lighter as they recede. And that's one of the things that creates aerial perspectives. Values get lighter as they recede. Also, the colors are cooler. These shadows back in here are a lot cooler than the shadows in front. Both are cool, but the background is cooler and more muted. So from that standpoint, this does have aerial perspective, but not enough. So I want to push the color difference a little more in the fact that I want to maybe emphasize these a bit darker in some dark accents, and these a bit lighter and maybe a bit cooler in the background. Because we can control how much depth. Don't just take the photo and look at it and say, well, there's some depth there, and then just copy it. Really think about how much depth you want to show and what you're going to do to create that depth. So value and color are the biggies, that things get cooler and more muted and lighter as they go back. But it's also really helpful to understand that it's a comparison. In other words, it's just not a matter of making the background colors a blue back in here and just say, well, it's cooler and bluer, so it's gonna recede. It has to be a comparison. It's cooler than the sunlit areas on the hill, because the sunlit areas on these hills back in here have to be cool also compared to the sunlit areas that are closer up in here. And they have to look sunlit in the background, these lights, but they have to be, again, cooler in comparison to the sunlit areas that are closer or more in the foreground. So it's the idea that everything is relative. It's not that everything in the background is just blue, because I can have violets, I can have kind of orange violets, red violets, and it'll work as long as it's cooler than what's in front of it. So it's a comparison thing. I can actually make these background hills pretty warm, again, as long as they're cooler than what's in front. So really think about how you want to proceed there using the idea of values getting lighter, colors getting cooler, and more muted as they recede. Now, a couple of paintings here. This is a Chauncey Ryder painting. Cloudy day, which we don't get to talk about enough, but you can see the colors get a lot cooler back in here. Even though on a cloudy day, all the colors are somewhat cool compared to a sunny day. The greens turn really blue in the background back in here. And here the greens have a lot more yellow. They're still kind of cool compared to a sunlit day, which would be more like that. That is warm. Now this really looks cool, these other greens, because there's just more blue in them compared to that yellow. And so you can see the colors gradually getting cooler from warmer greens, oranges, reds to now more violets. A little bit cooler reds and oranges, and then the lighter violets and just blues in the background. The other thing, besides value and color changing as it goes back, is the simplification. You're going to have your detail up front, and in the background, things are going to be really simplified. Again, in comparison, it's all relative. It's simplified in the background compared to the way it looks up front. This one is Alexander Jacob. He was a French painter right after the Impressionists. Not real well known, but he's got some interesting compositions and paintings and subject matter. And you can see the depth here. Very simplified, which makes the depth work even more. The more you can simplify your shapes, the more you get the sense of depth or sunlight or whatever it is you're trying to show. Detail just clutters things and makes it harder to sense what's important, in this case, depth. And you can see the trees, even though they're all cool and they're all dark, they're a bit warmer up here and a lot cooler way back in here. So it's that, again, that comparison thing. And the simplicity. There's no individual leaves. Everything's just large masses. Even the small stuff are masses. They're not picky. But very simple. Everything is pulled together. Everything's kind of in layers. You have the foreground layer here, middle ground layer in here, and then background layer back in there. So 3 or 4 layers there where he forces everything into one of those layers. And when you look at photographs, that's real important to kind of understand. When I look at this, it really gets cluttery and kind of hard to read in this area. Just everything bunches together, too much detail. So we want to simplify it as well as make things recede and go back. So the first thing here I would do is create a little bit of a compositional element to pull the viewer's eye in more. So you enter in here and you wind around and you pop into the sunlight there. And this is detail here, these little lights peeking through, but it gives a sense of kind of looking behind the shrubbery. When I do some of these small little highlights of looking through the bush, it gives the bush here more depth. Same thing with these bushes. Just gives them a bit more shape. Now you can overdo it real quick and it becomes way too picky. So you got to be real careful. But this has the viewer's eye going back into the background a little bit more. Now I want to start thinking layers. This foreground layer, darker darks in front. See, I've put those darker accents, not darks everywhere. The darkest darks are always small, those areas that don't get any kind of reflected light or anything, or ambient light. And then back in here, I want to start simplifying, pulling those shapes together, those green trees and shrubbery, massing them together. There's too many little lights and darks all over these trees. So when I pull them together, mass the darks together, mass the lights together a little bit more, it makes it easier to read. And that helps with creating depth, because as I go back, I'm going to simplify those lights and darks even more. And then, in this case, putting the lights on there. So you can see the simple dark shapes, simple light shapes. Value-wise, I'm keeping it lighter than the shadows up front here. And that's the key. So pulling them into a particular layer, in this case kind of a middle ground layer, and then lastly the background. And there's a lot going on in the background, even though these mountains are somewhat simplified. You got 2 or 3 values in the shadows, a lot of smaller little lights in here are little dots and dashes of dark and light shrubbery. More simplified than the foreground, but still too busy. So pulling it together, at least for the block in. Then I can decide if I want to go back into here and add another value showing darker shrubbery or lighter flat ground. Same thing in here. I could add maybe another value. But just remember, adding more detail, value changes, doesn't always help it. It sometimes can make it just more cluttery. So here I have kind of the middle ground or background layer and a middle ground layer and foreground layer. I'm forcing everything into those 3. Actually, you could break it up even more. 2 backgrounds, 2 middle grounds, a couple of foregrounds. But to keep things simple. Don't see too much. And the more I can simplify, the better. So that I go from really busy, somewhat some feeling of depth there, to really pushing it a bit more by simplifying and creating more contrast between the distant lights and the foreground lights, or middle ground lights in this case, and also with the darks, how much darker or how much lighter the background is. Again, there's some change in the photo, but I'm changing a bit more. And the simplifying really helps. Without the simplifying, that busyness makes everything come forward. Here I want to probably crop first. When I look at this, my focal point's right in here. These trees back in here, some of the smaller dark and light shapes, it creates kind of a nice feel in here. There's depth in that area. So I want to decide, do I want more of this side or do I want more of this side? Because I can't get it all. It's just too big. I want to crop, zoom in to what's more important. And I'm going to go more with the left side. So I will leave more of this left side, although I will cut out a lot of the sky and some of this tree grouping on the left side, but I'll eliminate a lot of the right side. And again, before computers, just always did this on sketchbooks, and I still use the sketchbook to do it, but I can kind of go through it first here. Now this, the sun is directly behind me, whereas in this scene, the sun is more in front. Not quite backlit, it's still over to the side, but more in front, so you get a lot more atmospheric perspective in here. Here I don't have it as much because the sun is behind and it's not filtering through that sunlight that gives you that strong shadows, and the shadows get lighter as I go back. Here there's not many shadows. So I have to take the large masses of the planes. In other words, the vertical trees here, there's a definite value change between the vertical shape of the trees and the slanted of this hillside and the flat. And of course the sky. So I really want to emphasize differences between those planes. Simplify them with those planes by pulling the planes together. So the first thing, here I'm going to start in the background. Just eliminate the busyness of that background hill. I probably want to suggest some of it because that's kind of the nature of these hills. This is in New Mexico. But if I cool it off, simplify it, and just have 2 or 3 values of that bluish violet or violet, that's going to make it stay back there. There's more contrast temperature-wise and value-wise between these trees here and the hill back in the background. It just created more distance there by eliminating the detail and pushing the background cooler. Then cooling down these trees and making them a bit lighter than what's there. They're a bit too dark here compared to the ones that are more in the middle ground. So getting more separation there really helps. And seeing these trees on this orange hill here, seeing them more in masses, there's too many individual trees here, and that just breaks it up too much. Now I can always go back and add more once everything is blocked in. I can decide how much more I can add if I want that feeling that you always get in the Southwest of those shrubbery on a hillside. But I don't have to. And I'm still being true to what's there. But that's what painting or art is creating your suggestion of what's there. And then lastly, just working in kind of the middle ground here, pulling those together. Cooling off these trees just a little bit. These trees right here, making them just a bit cooler than what was there. Too much yellow, orange in those trees. But they are warmer than what's back in here. So they're cooler than what's up front, but they're warmer than what's in back. And a lot of times for me, it takes a matter of mixing something up, putting it down on these 2 layers in just a spot or 2, and then looking at it and deciding what I need to change. It's not that I get it right the first time, but after I get a few values down and a few colors down, I can look at it and judge, do I have to get things cooler, warmer, lighter, darker, and that type of thing. So you can see, even though I just did the middle ground and background, simplifying that makes this foreground really come forward. Here, there's just too busy in the background, and the colors are too warm. So simplifying and cooling, I lightened some, but it's more temperature and busyness, simplifying. And the simplifying is a lot harder. I think we can catch on to the idea that things are lighter in the background or cooler, but that practice of pulling things together, eliminating what's not necessary, and creating larger masses can kind of throw us sometimes. This is in Arizona, northern Arizona. And nice light. Light's kind of coming from in front from the left side. And there's too much busyness in the tree here as well as the stuff in the background. It simplifies some as it goes back, but not enough. So if I can pull things together, starting with the foreground, just getting a slightly darker dark on this tree in the foliage, because this dark and this dark are almost the same. So there's no depth in there value-wise. So the first thing I want to do is pull the darks together more. So now there's a darker dark. Well, I'll be lightening this dark back in there to create more depth, but just making it more simple, more of a solid mass. Without getting too solid, there is openings, kind of dappled light coming through, but making it not quite as busy. and then adding the light so I get that feel of the sun coming from the upper left. And then I want to lighten and cool off the darks back in the background. And right next to the dark here in the foreground foliage, I go lighter and cooler in the background. So right where they meet, I get a bit bluer, just to make it, I wouldn't want to get this blue over this whole tree here, just right next to the orange one, because then you're pushing the warm and the cool and the slightly darker and slightly lighter right next to each other. And that creates more vibration and depth. Then the background back in here, and you can see the very background, those trees are too warm and dark. I lightened them, cooled them off compared to what was there, and also simplified them, which is the biggie thing here. I think just eliminating all those little dots and dashes and pulling things together. Same thing with these trees, just a simple mass of dark and light back in the background makes things a lot more simple. Cooling off the shadows more, because shadows get cooler as they recede also. Lightening up or getting a little lighter on this red barn. It's just a bit too dark in that background. So the changes, as long as I keep these real dark accents in front and lighten up the darks as they go back, that'll recede and getting cooler and more simple. I think getting more simple is what we really have to work on, because that is so important. You can get the values lighter, but if it's too busy, it won't go back. And then I got a little value change in the sky. There's just not enough. That creates more depth in the sky, gradually getting lighter as it recedes, and a bit warmer. This is more of a bluish green. This is more of a blue to blue violet up on top. And then in the foreground here, there is a stream, comes off a river nearby that kind of follows behind this hill. You can't see it, then you see it here, and it winds around there. It's not real necessary in the painting, but I kind of liked it, so I got rid of a lot of the shrubbery, the detail in there, and just had the stream put in. So again, that idea of massing things together, getting them more simple as they go back. Even up front, a lot more simple. But compared to the background, there's more detail in the front and a lot less in the background. This is a John Carlson, and you can see that at work here. The darkest darks up front, and they gradually get lighter, the darks do, and the colors get cooler. There's a lot of warmth back in here in these sunlit hills, but not as warm as in the middle ground or up front where there's a little bit of sunlight. You can have warm sunlight in the background, it just can't be as warm as the foreground. Comparing sunlit areas. And I usually want to push it cooler as much as I can, yet still having it look like distant sunlight. But you can also see the simplicity, more value changes in front, less in the background. There is color change in the background, but not much value change. If we make this a black and white, you can see it looks like there's not much change at all, because there's only really about 3 values in this background area. But when we put the color on, you see the color change. Same value, different color, and that creates vibration, but not detail. So when you want more variation, more interest, more vibration of color, keep the same value. Don't change the dark or the light, but just vary the color. And it just gives it a more finished, more refined look. This is a Corot, Camille Corot. You can see the simplicity in the background. You don't really need any detail. Just the value change of the darker here, getting a little lighter as it goes back, and of course cooler also. Really, really simplistic. Little detail to suggest some color variation and foliage and stuff, but just adding what's important. And this is by Edward Pothust. And you can see here, not just bluer, but no detail. There might be a window or two in these houses and a little bit of value change, but it's very, very simple in the background, because this is where he wants the attention, and less detail in the background means it recedes further. And lastly, another Carlson. You can see how much darker these darks are. It might be a bit too dark in this reference, this photograph of his painting, but you can see the difference in value from these darks to these darks. How that really creates the depth. Plus, these darks in the background are cooler. They're just bluer. The darks in the foreground is cool also, but not as cool as the bluish background. There's a bit of red in these shadows. And of course, the busyness in the foreground compared to the background really creates more depth in there. So remember those three things: value change, lighter as it goes back, cooler, more muted color, and just as important, if not more important, less detail, more simplistic everywhere, but especially as you recede.